Ford 999 looked like a machine someone had forgotten to add a body, brakes, a gearbox, and a survival instinct too. But that was exactly where its legend lay. At a time when the automobile was still an invention that caused amazement, not a common means of transport, Henry Ford created a vehicle so primitive, brutal, and dangerous that it looked more like an engine strapped to a wooden frame than a car. And yet it was precisely this monster that helped him build his name, gain publicity, and prepare the ground for one of the most important companies in automotive history. Ford 999 was not comfortable, sensible, or modern in today's sense. It had no body, no conventional steering wheel, no real gearbox, no differential, and almost nothing we associate with a normal car. What it did have was a huge four-cylinder engine with a displacement of almost 19 liters, a wooden frame, a flywheel the size of a manhole cover, and enough power to frighten even people used to risk at the beginning of the 20th century. It was a car built around one idea: win, break records, attract the press, and make the Ford name appear in the newspapers. And that is exactly what it did. The story of the Ford 999 begins even before the creation of the Ford Motor Company. Henry Ford had already built his first vehicle in 1896, known as the quadricycle. But the road to success was much harder than the later legend of the Model T suggests. Ford tried to enter the world of car production, but his first ventures ended in problems. In 1899, he left the Edison Illuminating Company, giving up a stable position to become involved with the Detroit Automobile Company. The company had investors, ambitions, and hopes, but the cars it produced proved too expensive, too unfinished, and not attractive enough to customers. The enterprise collapsed as early as January 1901. Ford then understood something very important. Technology alone was not enough. He had to win people's trust, and the best way to win that trust was speed. In an era when the press loved reporting on records and duels between constructors, victory in a race could mean more than the best advertisement. So Ford decided to prove his worth on the track. The first major step was the machine known as Sweepstakes. It was a racing car built in 1901, powered by a two-cylinder engine with a displacement of about 9 liters and a power output of roughly 26 or 27 horsepower. Today that may sound modest, but back then low weight, simplicity, and the driver's courage mattered. Ford himself sat behind the wheel during the race at Grosse Pointe, where his rival was Alexander Winton, one of the best-known American manufacturers and drivers of that time. Winton had a more powerful car and more experience, but Ford won. That victory was a breakthrough for him. It showed investors that he was not just a dreamer, but a man capable of building an effective machine. Thanks to the publicity after that win, the Henry Ford Company was founded. The problem was that Ford became increasingly interested in racing and promoting his own name, while his partners wanted stable production of utility cars. Conflict was inevitable. Ford left the company, which later, under the influence of Henry Leland, became Cadillac. Ford himself took with him experience, ambition, and an idea for an even crazier racing car. In 1902, Henry Ford joined forces with Tom Cooper, a well-known cyclist and a man connected with the world of sport. The goal was to build 2 powerful racing cars that would attract the attention of all America. The work was carried out in Detroit, in very modest conditions, often in the cold, on the upper floor of a garage, with the help of a small team of mechanics and constructors. Among the most important people were C. Harold Wills, Ed Spider Huff, and Gus DeGener. 2 almost twin vehicles were built. One was painted red, the other yellow. The red car later became the famous Ford 999, while the yellow one received the name Aero. The names were not accidental. 999 referred to the famous New York Central Empire State Express locomotive number 999, which in the 1890s became a symbol of speed after crossing the barrier of 100 miles per hour. Ford and Cooper wanted their car to have a similar meaning. It was to be a mechanical symbol of speed, American courage, and a new era of transport. The construction of the Ford 999 was extremely simple and extremely threatening. The car was built on a frame made of wood and steel elements. There was no conventional body, hood, or covers protecting the driver. The engine sat openly at the front, and all the important mechanical components were visible. The driver sat high, almost on the machine, more like a rider on a wild animal than a driver in a vehicle. Instead of a round steering wheel, a primitive steering system resembling a rod or wooden bar with handles was used. The front axle had semi-elliptic springs, but the rear was mounted rigidly, without suspension. This meant a brutally harsh ride, especially on the uneven tracks and roads of the early 20th century. There was no differential, which made cornering difficult. There was no normal gearbox, so the car was essentially tied to one operating range. The brake acted only on the rear axle. In practice, 999 was proof that in that period races were not won by finesse, but by courage, strength, and resistance to fear. The most important thing, however, was the engine. Ford 999 received an inline four-cylinder unit with a gigantic displacement of about 1,155 cubic inches, or roughly 18.9 liters. This is an absurd figure even by today's standards, and at the beginning of the 20th century, it made an almost unimaginable impression. The bore and stroke were enormous, and the engine worked at low revolutions, generating huge torque. Power was estimated differently, most often at about 70 to 100 horsepower. Some sources give about 75 horsepower. In today's world, such power does not seem great. But with the technology of the time and the absence of effective control systems, it was terrifying. The flywheel weighed over 100 kilograms and was completely exposed, which meant a real danger to the driver. The clutch was extremely primitive, based on a wooden element pressed against the flywheel. The entire vehicle was a mechanical demonstration of brutal energy. There was no elegance or comfort in it. There was only a huge engine, a frame, wheels, and a man who had to control it. Henry Ford quickly understood that he himself did not want to drive this monster in a race. After his experiences with the sweepstakes, he had had enough of direct risk, and 999 was far more dangerous. Barney Oldfield, a well-known cyclist who did not yet have experience with racing cars, but had courage and a sportsman's instinct, was chosen to drive the car. According to legend, Oldfield learned to drive a car very shortly before his first start. It sounds unbelievable, but it reflects well the realities of an era in which the boundaries between cyclist, motorcyclist, mechanic, and racing driver were much more fluid than today. Oldfield took the controls of 999 during the Manufacturers' Challenge Cup in Grosse Pointe in October 1902. Once again, the rival was Alexander Winton. Oldfield drove without calculation, practically at full throttle from start to finish. He covered the 5-mile distance in 5 minutes and 28 seconds, winning by a large margin. It was the birth of two legends, Barney Oldfield as the first great star of American racing, and Henry Ford as a constructor the whole industry was talking about again. The victory of the Ford 999 had enormous marketing significance. Henry Ford knew perfectly well that racing success could open doors to investors, customers, and newspapers. A car that on paper was a primitive construction built around a gigantic engine became a tool for building a brand. Oldfield and Cooper traveled around the country with 999, taking part in shows, races, and speed trials. The public was delighted, at a time when the automobile was still something extraordinary to many people. The sight of a large, loud machine traveling at speeds unavailable to ordinary vehicles worked like a circus performance and a technological demonstration at the same time. 999 became a symbol of speed. Ford benefited from this publicity even when he was no longer formally the full owner of the rights to the car. What mattered was that public opinion connected the machine with his name. It was precisely this fame that helped establish the Ford Motor Company in June 1903. It can be said that before Ford motorized America with the Model T, he first captured its attention with a roaring racing beast. Alongside the red 999, there was the yellow Arrow. Both cars were very similar, although they differed in technical details and purpose. Arrow was intended to be used, among other things, for speed attempts. Unfortunately, its story turned tragic. In 1903, during an event in Wisconsin, the car driven by young driver Frank Day suffered a serious accident. Day was killed, and the vehicle was badly damaged. The wreck returned to Ford, who decided to rebuild it. After the rebuild, the car was renamed and began to be referred to as the new 999, or the Red Devil. This change of names later caused a lot of confusion, because history included two closely related vehicles, the original red 999 and the rebuilt Arrow, also associated with the name 999. Regardless of this, it was the rebuilt Arrow that became the car in which Henry Ford undertook one of the riskiest attempts of his life. On the 12th of January, 1904, Henry Ford got into the rebuilt car on the frozen Lake St. Clair in Michigan. The goal was to set a speed record over the Flying Mile. The conditions were extreme. The ice was cracked, uneven, and treacherous, and the car had nothing in common with a precise record machine in today's sense. At speeds exceeding 140 kilometers per hour, 999 bounced, drifted off course, and required enormous control from Ford. Officially, an average speed of about 91.37 miles per hour was achieved, or about 147 kilometers per hour. It was a record that brought Ford enormous publicity, although European institutions did not fully recognize it because of differences in measurement procedures. For the American public, however, that did not matter much. Newspapers wrote about Ford, his courage, and his machine. The record lasted only a short time, but the advertisement was priceless. The Ford Motor Company, which had existed for only a few months, received exactly the kind of publicity it needed. The technical data of the Ford 999 shows how different this car was from later racing cars. Its length was close to that of a small modern car, but its weight was about 1,200 kilograms or slightly more, depending on configuration. The engine, with a displacement of almost 19 liters, dominated the entire construction. Drive went to the rear wheels through a simple shaft and final drive. The lack of a gearbox meant the vehicle was neither flexible nor easy to drive. The absence of a differential made corners a challenge. The lack of rear suspension meant brutal impacts transmitted to the frame and the driver. A brake only on the rear axle required anticipation and a large distance to stop. Steering with a tiller instead of a steering wheel required strength and feel. At the same time, the car used several solutions that were modern for its time, including pneumatic tires and shaft drive instead of chains, which were then common. 999 was therefore a mixture of primitiveness and innovation. It was not subtle, but it was effective where straight-line speed mattered. How many examples of the Ford 999 were built? In practice, two main cars of this type were built, the red 999 and the yellow Arrow. Both were twin racing constructions, although their later histories, rebuilds, and name changes made the story confusing. The original 999 is associated above all with Barney Oldfield and his victory in 1902. Arrow, after the tragic accident of Frank Day, was rebuilt and used by Henry Ford for the record attempt on the ice of Lake St. Clair. The surviving example, known as Old 999, is located in the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and is one of the most valuable exhibits connected with the beginnings of the Ford Motor Company. Replicas also exist, including later ones made for exhibitions and to commemorate the history of the brand. The original cars, however, were only two. This makes the Ford 999 one of the most unique machines in the history of American motorsport. It was not a production model, not even a small series. It was a promotional tool, a racing weapon, and a mechanical manifesto of Henry Ford's ambition. The value of the Ford 999 is very difficult to determine, because a car of this class practically does not function on the normal collector market. This is not an ordinary classic that can be compared with other examples of the same brand. It is one of the foundations of the history of the Ford Motor Company, American racing, and Henry Ford's career. If the original 999 ever appeared at auction, its price could reach a level counted in tens of millions of dollars. Not because it is beautiful, luxurious, or practical, but because its historical significance is enormous. Racing cars with such strong connections to the founders of great brands, speed records, and the birth of the automobile industry are almost priceless. In practice, 999 is a museum object that cannot be valued by ordinary methods. For Ford and for the history of the United States, it has symbolic value comparable to the most important artifacts of the Industrial Revolution. It is a vehicle that helped create the legend of the man who later changed the way cars were produced all over the world. That is why its true value goes beyond money. Ford 999 is an automotive icon because it was one of the first cars to prove that racing could build a brand. Henry Ford was not yet the king of mass production. He did not yet have the Model T, the moving assembly line, or a global empire. But he had the intuition that people had to hear his name and believe in his technology. 999 became the tool of that belief. It won an important race, made Barney Oldfield a star, gave Ford publicity, and showed that an American constructor could defeat famous rivals. It was also a symbol of the brutal phase of automotive development, when cars were often built according to the principle: bigger engine, less weight, more courage. It was not refined, but it was effective. It was not safe, but it was fascinating. It was not practical, but it played a practical role in the birth of one of the largest car companies in the world. That is why 999 has such a special place in history. It is a bridge between the world of garage experiments and the world of industrial giants. In the end, it is worth understanding that Ford 999 was not a legend, despite its primitiveness, but precisely because of it. It was a mechanical monster from an era in which limits were only just being created. Its construction shows fear, courage, lack of experience, and enormous ambition. It is a car that did not try to be elegant. It wanted to be fast. It did not try to protect the driver. It demanded that the driver have more courage than sense. It did not try to pretend to be a product for customers. It was a manifesto. Henry Ford could build machines that all America talked about. Without 999, Ford's story might have looked different. Perhaps the Ford Motor Company would have been founded anyway, but this car accelerated the birth of the legend. That is why the Ford 999 from 1902 remains an automotive icon. It is not just an old racing car. It is the vehicle that helped Henry Ford become Henry Ford and showed American motoring that speed could be the best advertisement for the future.